There have been many female royal consorts of British monarchs. This is their story. Born on the 1st of March 1683 to Margrave John Frederick of Brandenburg-Ansbach and Eleanor Erdmuth of Saxe-Meiningen, Caroline of Ansbach lost her father at 3 years old when he died of smallpox. Her mother remarried but was widowed 2 years later. Caroline's mother died in 1696, and Caroline and her brother William Frederick were sent to stay with their half-brother Margrave George Frederick II. However, George Frederick was not interested in parenting young children, so Caroline was sent to her new guardians, Frederick, Elector of Brandenburg, and his wife Sophia Charlotte. Frederick and Sophia Charlotte became King and Queen of Prussia in 1701. Caroline received an extensive education, unlike anything she had experienced before. She and Sophia Charlotte developed a strong relationship, with Caroline being treated as a surrogate daughter for the Queen. Caroline was seen as an intelligent and attractive young woman, and was a sought-after bride. A match between Archduke Charles of Austria and Caroline was proposed, but Caroline refused to convert to Catholicism, and so the marriage proposal was dropped. In 1705, Sophia Charlotte died, and this devastated the princess, leading her to sickness at times. That same year, Prince George of Hanover met Princess Caroline, and they fell in love with each other. On the 22nd of August 1705, they were wed in Hanover. On the 20th of January 1707, Caroline gave birth to their first child, Frederick. However, by July of 1707, Caroline fell ill with smallpox and pneumonia. Her husband cared for her devotedly and caught the illness himself. They both survived. Throughout their marriage, they had 7 more children: Anne, Amelia, Caroline, George, William, Mary, and Louisa. Their marriage was a loving marriage, although George did keep mistresses. Caroline was well aware of this, and he had told her about them. Caroline was faithful to her husband, and she kept her husband's mistresses as ladies in waiting to keep an eye on them. In 1714, Caroline's grandmother-in-law, the Dowager Electress Sophia, died at the age of 83, and Queen Anne of Great Britain died 2 months later. Caroline's father-in-law became King George I of Great Britain. Caroline and George, along with a few of their children, travelled to England towards the end of 1714. Their eldest son and heir, Prince Frederick, remained in Hanover for the entirety of George I's reign. Shortly after George I ascended the throne, Caroline's husband was invested as Prince of Wales, and Caroline received the title Princess of Wales, the first in 200 years. As George I was divorced and had not remarried, Caroline was the highest-ranking woman in Britain. Both Caroline and George made an effort to learn the English language, the people, politics, and customs of the land. 2 separate courts developed as a result, one that was composed of the king's German courtiers and ministers, and the court of the Waleses, composed of mostly English nobles and far more popular with the British people. After the baptism of their son, William George, the couple fell out of favour with the king and were banished from the king's household. Their children remained in the care of the king. George and Caroline greatly missed their children and visited without approval of the king. Eventually, the king allowed the couple to visit their children, especially when their infant son became seriously ill. The baby died, however, causing extreme grief for the parents. In 1727, George I died and Caroline's husband became George II. Caroline became Queen Consort and their joint coronation was held on the 11th of October 1727. Caroline was close to the Prime Minister Walpole, and though George wanted to remove Walpole from office, Caroline advised her husband to retain him as the leading minister. Caroline was quite liberal in her political opinions. She supported clemency for the Jacobites, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. George and Caroline did not have a good relationship with their eldest son Frederick, Prince of Wales. Due to their poor relationship and behaviour of their son, the Regency Act of 1728 made Caroline regent when her husband was abroad in Hanover. As queen, she surrounded herself with artists, writers and intellectuals, and spent much of her time in London. As she grew older, her health began to fail. She suffered from gout in her feet and an umbilical hernia after the birth of her final child. In November 1737, Caroline was suffering from intense pain in her intestines. Part of her small intestine had poked through the hernia. Over the following days, she was bled, purged, and operated on without anaesthetic, as was the custom of the day. However, her condition did not improve, and her husband refused the Prince of Wales to see the Queen, something she agreed with. On the 17th of November 1737, Caroline's strangulated bowel burst, but she lingered for 3 days before dying on the 20th of November 1737. Frederick was not invited to her funeral, which occurred on the 17th of December. Her death was mourned by both Protestants and Catholics. Her compassion and morality made her popular and helped to counteract much of the unpopularity of her husband and father-in-law. Born Sophia Charlotte on the 19th of May 1744, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Parents were Charles, Duke of Mecklenburg, Prince of Meerau, and Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. She was given a rudimentary education in botany, history, and language, with a particular focus on household management. Once her brother Adolphus Frederick succeeded to the throne, she gained more duties. As a princess, Charlotte was expected to marry, particularly to a wealthy, powerful prince or monarch. As she was from a politically insignificant German duchy and had no interest in politics, Charlotte was seen as an ideal bride for the unmarried British monarch George III. On the 8th of September 1761, Charlotte and George married. Charlotte could speak no English but quickly learnt the language, speaking with a strong German accent. Only a year later, the heir George was born, and they would go on to have 14 further children, of which 2 died in childhood. Charlotte and her mother-in-law, Princess Augusta, Dowager Princess of Wales, had a strained relationship. Augusta appointed much of Charlotte's staff, and they would report back to Augusta on Charlotte's behaviour. As such, Charlotte was not able to form long-lasting, trusting relationships with the English people of her court, and most of the companions she brought with her from Mecklenburg became her close friends. The royal couple's official residence was St. James's Palace, where they conducted business. But by 1762 they had moved into Buckingham House, and as the Queen spent more time there, it became known as the Queen's House, with most of their children being born there. Both of them preferred the countryside, and Kew Palace and Windsor Castle became places where they could have a domestic life that they wished for. Though Charlotte did not take much interest in politics, she did keep herself informed on any developments, especially ones pertaining to German issues, such as the Bavarian succession. In 1765, the king had a bout of mental illness that Charlotte's mother-in-law, Princess Augusta, did not make Charlotte aware of. The Regency Bill of 1765 was passed, which meant if the king became incapacitated, Charlotte would be regent. As the king's illness was only temporary, Charlotte was not made aware of either the bill nor her husband's condition. In 1788, the king's mental and physical health failed, distressing the Queen. The Prince of Wales and the Queen butted heads over who would assume the regency should the king's condition be permanent. Another bill was introduced in 1789 declaring the Prince of Wales regent if the king was permanently incapacitated. However, the king recovered and resumed his duties, negating the need for a regent. The Queen's mental health was also affected by her husband's condition. Quick to temper and distress, she no longer enjoyed musical concerts and public engagements which she had loved in the past. Her relationships with her children also deteriorated. Her only source of solace was gardening. From 1804, as the king's mental health declined, Charlotte avoided him as much as she could. Both George and Charlotte adored German music, awarding musicians such as Mozart and Bach special honours and promoting German music in Britain. Charlotte loved plants and had a keen interest in expanding her gardens by introducing non-native plants. She is also credited for introducing the Christmas tree in Britain. Women's education was an important topic for the Queen. Having received an inadequate education herself, she set out to ensure her daughters did not suffer the same fate. However, she restricted their independence and refused to allow them to marry until they were older. Because of this, none of her married daughters had any surviving children. Charlotte and Queen Marie Antoinette of France had a close friendship, sharing a love for music and art. They often confided in each other about their struggles through pen and paper. At the outbreak of revolution in France, Charlotte was prepared to accept the French royal family into her home and even prepared rooms for them. However, Charlotte was devastated upon hearing the news of their executions. In her later years, Charlotte's husband George was declared insane in 1811, and their eldest son George became regent. As the highest-ranking female member of the royal family, Charlotte served as a hostess for official functions, but her popularity declined as the years went on. On the 17th of November 1818, Charlotte passed away in Kew Palace in the presence of the Prince Regent. At 57 years, she is the longest-serving female consort of a British monarch and the second longest-serving consort of a British monarch after Prince Philip. Caroline of Brunswick was born on the 17th of May 1768 to Charles, Duke of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel, and his wife, Princess Augusta of Great Britain, one of the sisters of George III. Her childhood was difficult as her father was openly cheating on her mother, and this created a toxic environment for her, and she was unable to be friendly to one parent without the other scolding her. Caroline received a limited education, never being able to properly spell correctly, although she could understand German, English and French. She also lacked contact with members of the other sex, even for a woman of her time. At the wedding of her elder brother, Charles, she was allowed to dance for the first time, but only with the groom and her brother-in-law, the Prince of Orange. Though there were a number of matches suggested for Caroline, including the Prince of Orange and the Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, none came to fruition. Caroline fell in love with an Irishman, but because of his status, they were forbidden to marry. On the 8th of April 1795, Caroline and George, Prince of Wales, were married. They were first cousins. They had not met before, only meeting days before the wedding. Both were disappointed in their future spouse. During the marriage, they only had relations 3 times. However, that was enough for a child to be produced. Almost exactly 9 months after their wedding, on the 7th of January 1796, Caroline gave birth to Princess Charlotte. George had numerous mistresses, and the relationship between the married couple deteriorated further. They led separate lives and lived apart from each other. George prevented Caroline from seeing their child as much as possible. Though pleased to have an heir, George still wanted a son to ensure the line of succession and tried to engage with his estranged wife. However, this was unsuccessful, and the couple only had one child, Charlotte. Having only one child was not enough for Caroline, and so Caroline adopted 8 children from poor families and fostered them out to families in the community. Allegations of affairs on Caroline's part were brought up as possibility for George to divorce his wife. However, there was no foundation for these allegations, and they were proven false. After her husband became Prince Regent, Caroline was further restricted from seeing her daughter. She was not invited to state events and was excluded from court. In 1814, Caroline chose to leave Britain for the continent, moving between countries like Italy and Switzerland. In 1816, Princess Charlotte married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and a year later, in 1817, she gave birth to a stillborn son, and subsequently died. Caroline discovered the fate of her daughter and her grandson from a passing courier and was devastated by the death. She had lost her daughter, but also her only chance of regaining a position at court once her daughter became queen. On the 29th of January 1820, George III died and Caroline's husband became king. Her situation became worse. Caroline was not treated like a queen, and though popular with the ordinary people of Britain, she was immensely unpopular with the nobility and royalty throughout Europe. On the 19th of July 1821, Caroline was barred from entering Westminster Abbey for the coronation. That night she fell ill, and 3 weeks later, on the 7th of August 1821, she died. Her official cause of death was intestinal obstruction, but theories of cancer and poisoning have also been suggested. Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen was Queen of the United Kingdom from 1830 until the death of her husband William IV in 1837. Adelaide was the eldest child of George I, Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, and Louise Eleanor of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Saxe-Meiningen was a small state that did not bar women from ruling. However, it was not until her brother Bernard was born in 1800 that primogeniture was enacted. In 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales died, and George III had no living legitimate grandchildren. Each of his unmarried sons married quickly, including William IV. Even though Adelaide was from an unimportant German state, as there were no other options and any deals William had made with other candidates had fallen through, he married her on the 11th of July 1818, having only met her the previous week. Though not in love, they settled into a married life in Hanover and were devoted to each other. Soon after their wedding, Adelaide became pregnant, but gave birth prematurely to a daughter, Charlotte, on the 27th of March 1819. Charlotte lived only a few hours. They decided to move back to England to ensure that any further children they had would be born on English soil. However, Adelaide miscarried and had stillbirth children throughout the rest of their marriage. The only other living child they had together was Princess Elizabeth, who was born on the 10th of December 1820. She sadly passed away when she was only 3 months old on the 4th of March 1821. Adelaide and William had no surviving children together. In 1830, George IV passed away, and William succeeded as king. William conferred the rangership of Bushy Park to Adelaide, allowing her to live at Bushy House for the rest of her life if she so wished to. Adelaide and William were jointly crowned on the 8th of September 1831. Adelaide was loved by the British people, and she was very charitable, giving a large amount of her income to charity. Both William and Adelaide were fond of their niece, Princess Victoria of Kent, and wished to care for her, but were often thwarted by Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent. In June 1837, William died, and his niece Victoria acceded the throne as Queen Victoria. Adelaide had poorer health as the years progressed and moved to warmer countries like Malta. She passed away on the 2nd of December 1849. Alexandra of Denmark was born on the 1st of December 1844 in the Yellow Palace in Copenhagen, Denmark. Her parents were Christian IX of Denmark and Louise of Hesse-Kassel. She had 5 siblings: Frederick, George, Dagmar, Tura, and Valdemar. Growing up, she lived a very modest life, and her father did not have a large income. In 1848, Christian VIII of Denmark died, and his only son Frederick ascended the throne. Frederick had no children from 2 failed marriages, and a succession crisis arose. Frederick ruled in both Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, where there were 2 forms of succession. In Denmark, both men and women could inherit, although male preference primogeniture was in place. However, in Schleswig-Holstein, only men could inherit. In 1852, it was decided that Alexandra's father would be the heir. Alexandra and her family moved into Bernstorff Palace, and although their status had risen, they received no increase in their income. By the late 1850s, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and her husband Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha were searching for a wife for their eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. Their eldest daughter, Crown Princess Victoria of Prussia, was enlisted by her parents in seeking a suitable candidate. Alexandra was not their first choice, as the Danes were at conflict with the Prussians over the territory of Schleswig-Holstein. However, eventually Alexandra was chosen as the only suitable candidate for their son. In 1861, Alexandra met Albert after Crown Princess Victoria introduced the two to each other. A year later, Albert proposed to Alexandra and she accepted. Though they had only met a few times and didn't really know each other, they were wed on the 10th of March 1863 in St. George's Chapel. The English court was still in mourning for Albert's father, who had died in December 1861. So ladies were restricted to wearing grey, lilac and mauve, and only Alexandra's closest relations were invited to the wedding, which upset many of her Danish relatives, who were not invited. After her wedding, Alexandra went by the title of the Princess of Wales. By 1864, Alexandra's father was King of Denmark, her brother George was King of the Hellenes, her sister Dagmar was engaged to the Tsarevich of Russia, and Alexandra had given birth to her first child, Albert Victor, although he was more affectionately known as Eddie by the family. Alexandra and Albert would go on to have 5 more children: George, Louise, Victoria, Maud, and Alexander John. According to Queen Victoria's diaries, all of the children were born prematurely. However, it is more likely that Alexandra misled Queen Victoria on the delivery dates, so that the Queen would not be present during the births of her children. During the birth of Louise, Alexandra contracted rheumatic fever, which threatened her life. Though she recovered, she was left with a permanent limp. The German invasion of Schleswig-Holstein had a profound effect on Alexandra, who grew to greatly dislike Germany. She and her husband supported Denmark during the war, which was a point of contention for her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, and her sister-in-law, Crown Princess Victoria. Alexandra was popular amongst the English. She appeared dignified, charming, and affectionate. She greatly enjoyed dancing, ice skating, and hunting, much to her mother-in-law's dismay. With her husband, Alexandra went on many international tours, such as tours to Ireland, Austria, Egypt, and Greece. The Prince and Princess of Wales set up residence in Sandringham House and Marlborough House. Their marriage was mostly happy, although Albert didn't give his wife as much love and affection as she would have liked. They became closer when Albert almost died from typhoid fever in 1671, and their youngest son, Alexander John, died. Alexandra and Albert wanted privacy when their youngest son died, but Queen Victoria insisted on a period of court mourning and a funeral for the infant, which the press saw as a sickening mummery. Alexandra mostly looked the other way as her husband had liaisons with other women and was perpetually unfaithful to her. Throughout her life, Alexandra suffered from several physical disabilities. She suffered from progressive deafness, otosclerosis, and a limp. When the ladies of her court and society at large saw that Alexandra had a limp, they adopted a similar limp in it as fashionable. 3 years in the late 1870s, Alexandra remained separated from her 2 sons as her sons went on a worldwide cruise as part of their naval and general education. Alexandra showed herself to be an affectionate and loving mother who wrote regularly to them. In 1881, Alexandra and Albert Edward travelled to Russia to represent Britain at the funeral of Alexander II of Russia, and to comfort Alexandra's sister Dagmar, who became the Tsarina. Alexandra undertook many public duties for the Queen and became the public face of the monarchy along with her husband. In 1892, her eldest son, Eddie, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, died after contracting influenza. Alexandra fell into a deep mourning and had his room and possessions kept exactly as he had left them, similar to how Queen Victoria had reacted after her husband Prince Albert's death in 1861. Queen Victoria passed away in 1901, and Albert Edward and Alexandra became the King and Queen of the United Kingdom. That same year, Alexandra and her husband cared for their grandchildren, while her son George and his wife Mary went on an extensive tour of the British Empire. Days before the scheduled coronation, in June 1902, Albert Edward, now Edward VII, fell ill with appendicitis. The coronation was postponed so Edward VII could recover from his surgery. Alexandra stood in for the king during a military parade and the royal ascot races to avoid public alarm. In August 1902, the coronation was held and Alexandra and Edward were crowned together. Alexandra's duties changed little, and she kept on the same servants when she became queen. In December 1903, Alexandra's woman of the bedchamber, Charlotte Knollys, saved the queen's life after her room began to fill with smoke. She roused Alexandra and brought her to safety. After Alexandra's father died, Alexandra and her sister Dagmar bought a villa in Denmark in order to retain their family links. They used it as a private getaway. Alexandra was denied access to her husband's papers and was excluded from some foreign tours and politics. In 1910, Alexandra attended a debate at the British House of Commons, becoming the first Queen Consort to visit the House of Commons. During a visit to her brother George I of Greece, her husband fell ill. Alexandra arrived back in England only the day before her husband died. On his deathbed, she nursed him and allowed his mistress Alice Keppel to visit. Albert died on the 6th of May 1910. Alexandra refused to allow his body to be moved, and only after over a week did she agree to have his body removed. She moved out of Buckingham Palace to Marlborough House and retained Sandringham House until her death. Alexandra did not attend her son's coronation in 1911, which was customary. It was normal for a crowned queen not to attend the coronation of another king or queen. She continued to work for the monarchy. In 1918, her nephew Tsar Nicholas II and his family were assassinated, and she had her sister Dagmar rescued from Russia in 1919. Dagmar and Alexandra spent some time together. Throughout her senior years, Alexandra remained youthful in her appearance, but eventually the years caught up to her. From 1920, she suffered from partial blindness accompanied by profound deafness. Alexandra passed away on the 20th of November 1925 from a heart attack. She lay in state at Westminster Abbey before being buried beside her husband in St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Mary of Teck was born on the 26th of May 1867 in Kensington Palace. She was the only daughter of Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, a granddaughter of George III of the United Kingdom. Mary was born in the same room as her cousin Queen Victoria had been over 48 years earlier. Her parents named her after Queen Victoria, with Mary's first name actually being Victoria. Mary was the eldest of 4 children and had a happy but strict upbringing. She learned to be discreet, firm, and tactful in order to resolve her 3 brothers' arguments. The children played with the children of the Prince of Wales, who were close in age to them. Mary and her family lived in Kensington Palace and White Lodge, granted to them by the Queen. While her brothers were educated at boarding school, Mary was educated by her mother and governess at home. Her parents were not wealthy and often lived abroad with a small staff to economize. Mary grew to be fluent in English, German, and French. In 1885, Mary and her family returned to London. By this time, Mary had become her mother's unofficial secretary and helped her mother to organise parties. In 1886, Mary debuted in society, and being the only unmarried British princess who was not a descendant of Queen Victoria, made her a desirable candidate for Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. In 1891, Albert proposed to Mary and she accepted. Unfortunately, Albert Victor died only weeks later of pneumonia. Albert's brother George, Duke of York, became close to Mary and proposed to her in 1893. That same year, in July, the couple were wed. They were deeply in love with each other and were never unfaithful. They had 6 children together: Edward, Albert, Mary, Henry, George, and John. The couple lived in York Cottage and in St. James's Palace. They led a simple, quiet life. Their children were cared for by a nanny, which was normal for upper-class families. However, the nannies they hired ended up abusing the children and were promptly fired. Eventually, the affectionate and much-loved Charlotte Bell was hired as the children's nanny. Mary and George were quite distant and cold towards their children, but they did love them very dearly. As Duke and Duchess of York, the couple carried out a variety of public duties in support of the Queen. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria died, and Mary's father-in-law ascended the throne as Edward VII. For the rest of 1901, George and Mary toured the British Empire, something no royal had ever done before. The King and Queen took care of their children while they were away. In November, George was created Prince of Wales with Mary as Princess of Wales. They moved into Marlborough House. On the 6th of May 1910, Edward VII died and George became George V, with Mary as his Queen Consort. Mary decided to drop her first name and became known as Queen Mary. She was the first British Queen Consort to be born in Britain since Catherine Parr. On the 22nd of June 1911, the King and Queen were crowned together in Westminster Abbey, and on the 12th of December 1911, they were crowned Emperor and Empress at the Delhi Durbar in India. While Mary and her mother-in-law Queen Alexandra were on friendly terms, Alexandra was stubborn and demanded that she take precedence over Mary at the funeral of Edward VII. She also kept some of the royal jewels, which should have passed on to Mary as the new queen. During the First World War, Mary instituted austerity measures at the palace. Food was rationed and she visited wounded and dying servicemen in hospitals. In 1917, the royal house's surname was changed to the English-sounding Windsor, as anti-German feeling ran high in Britain. 2 months after the war, Queen Mary's youngest child, John, died at the age of 13. His death caused immense shock and sorrow for his parents. The couple became closer, and Mary continued to be of great support for her husband in the later half of his reign. She offered him much advice and was a calming presence for the king. From the late 1920s, George fell ill numerous times with lung problems. Mary nursed him when he was sick. In 1935, George V celebrated his Silver Jubilee, and paid tribute to his wife in his speech. On the 20th of January 1936, George V died. Their eldest son, Edward, ascended the throne as Edward VIII. Mary was then known as just Queen Mary. By the end of the year, Edward had abdicated, and Mary's second son, Albert, had ascended the throne as George VI. Mary was supportive of her son, Edward, but could not understand why he would neglect his duties and abdicate. Mary took a keen interest in the upbringing of her granddaughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, the only children of George VI. She took them on excursions in London to art galleries and museums to compensate for their lack of an educational regime. During the Second World War, George VI wanted his mother to evacuate from London, and while she was hesitant to do so, she decided to live at Badminton House in Gloucestershire, the home of her niece, the Duchess of Beaufort. During the war, she visited troops and factories and directed the gathering of scrap materials. After the war, in June 1945, Mary returned to Marlborough House. Mary was an eager collector of objects and photos that had a royal connection. Most of the time, she obtained the objects by paying for them. On other occasions, she would express a desire for someone's possession and expect that that person would give it to her. In February 1952, the king died. By this point, half of her children were dead, with her son George having died in 1942 during an air crash. Her eldest granddaughter, Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. Little over a year later, Mary died on the 24th of March 1953 in her sleep. Before her death, she had let it be known that the coronation should not be postponed should she die beforehand. Her body lay in state at Westminster Hall before she was buried beside her husband at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Born Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon on the 4th of August 1900 in London, she was the 9th child of 10 children born to Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and Cecilia Cavendish Bentinck. She grew up in Glamis Castle and was educated by a governess. She started going to school at the age of 8 in London and passed her Oxford local examination at the age of 13. On her 14th birthday, Britain went to war with Germany. 4 of her older brothers served in the army. Her brother Fergus died while fighting in the Battle of Loos in 1915. Her other brother Michael was detained in a prisoner of war camp until the end of the war. Glamis Castle became a convalescent home for wounded soldiers during the war, and Elizabeth helped run it. During her early 20s, Elizabeth grew close to Prince Albert Bertie, Duke of York, and he proposed to her in 1921. However, she rejected the proposal as she did not want to lose her freedom. Queen Mary, Bertie's mother, met Elizabeth and was convinced that Elizabeth was the one who would make her son happy. Bertie proposed a further 2 times, in 1922 and 1923. In 1923, Elizabeth agreed to marry Bertie, and they were married on the 26th of April 1923 in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth began the tradition of leaving her wedding bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior, a tradition still continued amongst royal brides today. After their wedding, they honeymooned in Pollinston Lacey, a manor house in Surrey, before going to Scotland where she got whooping cough. Elizabeth had a charismatic aura about her and did well on international and national tours. Her husband had quite a bad stammer, which affected his confidence and ability to do speeches, a necessity for his job. She found a speech and language therapist, Lionel Logue, to help him. In 1926, the couple's first child, Princess Elizabeth, was born. Their second child, Princess Margaret, was born in 1930. On the 20th of January 1936, Bertie's father, George V, died and Edward, the Prince of Wales, became Edward VIII. After only 11 months, Edward abdicated so he could marry Wallis Simpson, a divorcee. Bertie became king, George VI and Elizabeth became Queen Consort. Their coronation was held on the 12th of May 1937. Becoming king put a huge strain on Bertie, but Elizabeth remained a steadying and supporting force for the king. As king and queen, they made an international trip to France to increase the Anglo-French solidarity as Nazi Germany was becoming increasingly aggressive in their international relations. The couple also went to the USA and Canada to boost support in the event of a potential war with Germany. During the Second World War, the king and queen remained in England, living in Windsor Castle. Initially unpopular when visiting affected areas of London during the war, when Buckingham Palace was bombed, Elizabeth felt she could look the people in the face. Elizabeth was also given revolver training. After the war, the royal family visited South Africa in 1947. They postponed their trip in 1948 to Australia and New Zealand as the king's health was deteriorating. In 1951 and 1952, Elizabeth and her daughters did most of the public engagements for the king. On the 6th of February 1952, months after the king had received treatment for his lung cancer, the king died. At the age of 52, the queen was widowed. To differentiate between the new queen and the old queen, both named Elizabeth, the older of the two went by the title of the Queen Mother, or as she was affectionately known by the public, the Queen Mum. Devastated by her husband's sudden death, she moved to Scotland, finding the countryside like a breath of fresh air, and helping her to cope with her husband's sudden death. Eventually, she returned to public duties, keeping busy and being a supportive hand for the new queen, her daughter. While Queen Elizabeth II went on tour of the Commonwealth in 1953 and 1954, Elizabeth acted as regent and also looked after her grandchildren. Elizabeth bought the Castle of May, a run-down castle that was in need of extensive work. Every year, she would go there in August and October. Like most members of the British royal family, she also adored horse racing and owned a number of winning horses. During her life, Elizabeth had a number of bouts of cancer, managing to survive each attack. In 1966, she was diagnosed with colon cancer, and in 1984 with breast cancer. For both, she received treatment. The Queen Mother was one of the most long-lived members of the British royal family. In her final years, she continued to work, last attending a public engagement at the recommissioning of HMS Ark Royal on the 22nd of November 2001. In December 2001, Elizabeth fractured her pelvis after a fall, but insisted on attending her husband's 50th memorial service in February 2002. Her daughter Margaret passed away on the 9th of February 2002, only 3 days later. Despite being quite frail at this point, she attended her daughter's funeral. Over the next few weeks, Elizabeth's health began to fail, and she passed away in her sleep on the 30th of March 2002 with her daughter Elizabeth by her side. Her funeral was held on the 9th of April 2002. Born Camilla Rosemary Shand, Queen Camilla was born on the 17th of July 1947 in London to Major Bruce Shand and the Honourable Rosalind Cubitt. She grew up in Sussex, and she has one younger sister called Annabel Elliot, and she also had one younger brother named Mark. One of her great-grandmothers, Alice Keppel, was a mistress of Edward VII of the United Kingdom. Her mother volunteered at various charities, and her father made various business ventures after retiring from the army. From a young age, Queen Camilla loved to read and ride horses. Her childhood was mostly happy. At the age of 5, Camilla was sent to Drumbrels, a co-educational school, before attending Queen's Gate at the age of 10. She was bright, lively and confident, and was popular amongst the students. After completing one O-level in 1964, she left to attend Montfertile Finishing School in Switzerland. After this, she studied French and French literature at the University of London Institute in Paris for 6 months. In 1965, Camilla was a debutante in London and soon shared a flat in Kensington with a friend. In her early adult years, she worked as a secretary in the West End and as a receptionist in Mayfair. In the early 1960s, Camilla met Andrew Parker Bowles and they had an on and off relationship for years. Eventually, they married on the 4th of July 1973. Several members of the British royal family attended the wedding, including the Princess Royal, Queen Elizabeth II, and Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. Camilla and Andrew made their home in Wiltshire, and they had 2 children, Tom and Laura. Though her husband and children were Catholic, Camilla remained Anglican and did not convert. In 1995, the couple divorced. Camilla's mother, Rosaline, died in July 1994 from osteoporosis, and accompanied with the end of her first marriage, that year was a particularly difficult time for Camilla. Camilla met the then Prince Charles, Prince of Wales, in 1971. Andrew and Camilla had already broken up, and Andrew was dating Princess Anne. They met for the first time at the home of their friend Lucia Santa Cruz and became close friends. Their friendship developed into a romantic relationship, and as their relationship became more serious, each introduced the other to their respective families. The relationship was put on hold while Charles was in the Navy, but it ended. Camilla did not wait for Charles, as she was not sure he would want to be with her once he left the Navy. The royal family had made it clear that Camilla was not seen as a suitable wife for a future king, and Charles had not made it clear to Camilla her to wait. They stayed in contact, and by the mid-1980s, they were having an affair. Their affair became public knowledge in the press in 1992 with the publication of Diana, Her True Story, a book about Charles's wife Diana. The media vilified Camilla because of this. Her reputation never truly recovered, but after marrying Charles in 2005 and after much PR improvement, her reputation has somewhat recovered. After Charles divorced Diana in 1996 and Diana's subsequent death in 1997, Charles and Camilla began a relationship, which was made official to the public in 1999. In February 2005, Charles and Camilla's engagement was announced. Charles gave Camilla a ring which had belonged to his grandmother, the Queen Mother. As both were divorced, the prospect of Charles marrying Camilla was seen as controversial. But they were given consent by the Queen, the government, and the Church of England. They were wed on the 9th of April 2005 in a civil ceremony followed by a religious service of blessing. None of their parents attended the civil ceremony, but their parents did attend the service of blessing. Following their wedding, Camilla took the title of Duchess of Cornwall. Legally, she was the Princess of Wales. However, out of respect for Diana, the previous Princess of Wales, and Charles's first wife, Camilla took one of the feminine versions of Charles's subsidiary titles, the Duke of Cornwall. Camilla became a grandmother for the first time in 2007. She has 5 grandchildren: Lola, Eliza, Gus, Louis, and Frederick. She is also a stepmother to Charles's children, William and Harry, and a step-grandmother to their children. Camilla has a number of interests and is a patron of several organisations, including Battersea Dogs and Cats Home, Maggie's Cancer Caring Centres, and the London Chamber Orchestra. In 1994, Camilla became a member of the National Osteoporosis Society, following the death of her mother from the disease. Her grandmother had also died from the disease in 1986. In 2006, she launched the Big Bone Walk campaign, leading 90 children and people with osteoporosis for a 10-mile walk and climb around Loch Muick in Scotland to raise money for the charity. It raised £200,000 and continues every year to this day. On the 1st of January 2022, Queen Elizabeth II made Camilla a Royal Lady of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, and a month later the Queen made it clear that she wished for Camilla to be known as the Queen Consort. Upon her son ascending the throne, Camilla became the Queen Consort on the 8th of September 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. Her husband became known as Charles III. On the 10th of September 2022, Camilla attended the Proclamation Council of Charles III as a witness. Camilla was crowned Queen on the 6th of May 2023 alongside her husband.